Hello and welcome to the Musical Instrument Investigator. Today we are on the French auction portal website of Inter-Enchères. We can have a look at an auction by Vichy on shares. This is an auction house we've looked at before. They tend to do auctions in groups of 3, so we're going to have a look at the first auction of 3. This particular one is happening on the 31st of May. So it's the 23rd of May today, so for once there's a bit of time before this auction starts. Looks like there are about 339 lots in this auction, so this is a bit more friendly than normal, as the Vichy do like to cram in about 500 lots every single auction, so they're a bit friendlier this time. 24% looks like it's the buyer's premium. As I said, this is a French auction, so if you are buying from outside France, check all the terms and conditions, the kind of import, export and other fees, etc, etc, just to make sure that you're not kind of roped into extra fees that you weren't expecting. Yeah, like I said, this one, historically these Vichy auctions are a little bit tough to get through because there's a lot of the same kind of stuff, a lot of the same French things, obviously because it's a French auction, French violins, French bows, etc, which is obviously exciting to some people, but when you see like 100 of the same thing, it gets a bit difficult. So I've not looked at this auction at all, so let's hope that there's actually some interesting stuff, and we'll just crack on and try and get through it as quickly as possible, and if there's anything really interesting then we'll concentrate on that. So yeah, let's get on with it, and let's invoke our translation rights here. So a 3/4 Mircore violin from the 20th century with a Violin label, so we're onto a classic Vichy start. Actually quite a nice looking back on that, but I fear that we are in for a whole load of these kinds of instruments. 20th century Mircore violin. I think we're just going to have to really blitz through it this time. Violin by Palliot, made in Mircore around 1830, with an iron mark 362. His length of back, neck off. That's actually quite nice, a bit nicer than the average. Needs a bit of work. Estimate €400. Violin by Charles Bailey, made in Mircore 1929. It's got a damaged heel, quite a nice back on that, so obviously in need of work. 20th century Mircore violin, a Marty label 359, length of back, looks a bit more standard there. Violin from Eastern Europe, late 19th century, Guadagnini label. Curious. Violin Mircore 20th century, label of Menason. It's had a few restorations already. Violin Mircore 20th century, Lorenzi label. Mircore violin 1930, Paul Boucher label. We're just gonna keep going through. Violin made in Mircore, beginning of the 19th century, in parts. It's actually really nice back on that. €200, not bad, quite like that. So far this auction is fairly interesting. French provincial 19th century violin with a front label, 365, wow, that's really big. €600 is the estimate. 20th century Mircore there with the Lupo label, looks a bit more standard. Few interesting things so far. Another 20th century Mircore violin, Guarnerius label. JTL, I was waiting for a JTL violin to come. 20th century, doesn't look too bad actually. Violin by Francois Barbe, Mircore, around 1840. Violin, second part of the 18th century, from the Austrian school, Guarnerius label, without its head, different restoration. That is in a bit of a state, so just the body there, €800, interesting looking thing there. German violin, early 20th century, cracks on the table. Once again, not too bad. And a violin from the Heberlein workshop, Mark de Kirken. German violin, beginning of the 20th century, Steiner label. 20th century miracle violin, Strad label. Violin from the Kuzno house in Miracle. Three-quarter miracle violin. Violin made by Lebert Humbert workshop, interesting back. Three-quarter violin by Claude Nicolas Collin, Miracle, around 1830. Another JTL violin here, Miracle, 20th century. French violin with the Gaffino label, interesting. 3,000 to 4,000 euros, so that's a serious one. We're onto some bows again. Violin bow from the Simon school. So we're on two pictures for that. Violin bow from the Vorin school. German bow, signed A. de Roux, Paris. Interesting looking thing. Cello bow here from the Kinyohuri Usha workshop. Violin bow by Francois Lotte. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lotte. Viola bow from the Pajot School, circa 1845. Frog and Button by R.F. Lotte. Violin bow by Pierre Malin. The other lot was a violin bow. I forgot to mention that. Violin bow stick from the Bazaar School. Violin bow by JTL, our good friends JTL. Back once again, interesting enough. A violin bow from the Simon School in exotic wood. German cello bow, signed Arthur Thoma. Violin bow by Louis Bazin. A violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Viola bow by Eugene Cugnot. Violin bow by JGL. It's an interesting one here. Violin bow of the Bazaar School, exotic wood, nickel silver. Interesting looking bow. Miracle viola bow from the 1960s. Violin bow from the workshop of Louis Bazin. On to page 2. Okay. Viola bow by JTL. Viola bow, violin bow stick by Charles Louis Bazin. Violin bow by Emile Francois Huchard. 20th century miracle violin, the Strad label. Violin of the German school around 1900, the Klotz label. It's that typical kind of trade violin of that time. 20th century miracle violin. It's not so nice. 3/4 size large French 19th century violin, 345. Interesting. Almost getting to normal size there. Miracle violin. 20th century miracle violin. JTL violin. Violin from the Colomazza workshop. Miracle violin, JTL. Violin by Antoine Girardin. Miracle 1760. Interesting looking back on that. Looks really quite tradey, doesn't it, from afar, but curious. €800. Yeah, some of these older French violins, some of these, the chapuis and stuff, they look really strange, very strange. French violin, provincial violin there. Traces of worm. Violin by Gustave Viaume, 1934. That's interesting. Traces of worm on the table. Couldn't quite see that, but maybe here. €400 the estimate. Miracle violin, beginning of the 20th century. Another French violin, second part of the 19th century, with a Viaume label, 366. That's pretty long. Violin from the Lebert Humbert workshop. Violin from the JTL workshop. Late 19th century violin with a Bernadelle label. Another JTL violin here. '20th century miracle violin, Breton. French violin, early 20th century, signed J. Bourdoin. If the picture wants to load. 20th century German violin, Steiner label. Violin by Albert Deblay. Violin made in the Lebert workshop, Miracle. Violin made the workshop of JTL. Interesting back. French violin, second part of the 18th century. Labelled repaired by Derezy. Violin bow from the Bazin school, made for Julien Levesque. Violin bow from the German school. Violin bow by JTL. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. Violin bow stick from the Usha school. Violin bow from the Bazin school. Violin bow from the Bazin Usha school. Violin bow by Marc Lebert. When it loads up. Violin bow by Otto Derschmidt. Cello bow by Charles Nicholas Bazin. Double bass bow by Joseph Thomason. Definitely needs a bit of work. Viola bow by JTL. A Bausch school violin bow. German violin bow. Violin bow from the German school. Violin bow from the workshop of Bazin. 20th century German violin bow. Violin bow by El Morizon Frère. Violin bow stick by Vichy with a French frog. And a violin bow by El Morizon. And onwards to the next page, which looks a bit more interesting. We have a violin bow frog from the Picat school. I'm looking for €500 for that. Interesting. Bazin school violin bow. Double bass bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Double bass bow by Joseph Thomasin. Violin bow by El Morizon. Early 20th century violin with a Carlo Fratelli label. It's kind of curious, €400. Violin by Joseph Pascalin, made in Paris, 1888. That's quite interesting. It's a curious looking one. Mansui violin, made in Mirco around 1830-1840. A violin, Mirco 20th century, with an imitation JB Violin label. 20th century Mirco violin with a Guarnerius label. Half-size Mirco violin there. Nice looking back. A German violin from the beginning of the 20th century. Mirco violin, 20th century. The Marquis de la Doiseau. 20th century Mirco violin with a Violin label. Violin by Jacques Barbe, Mirco 1840. German violin from the beginning of the 20th century, the Magini label. Mirco violin. Violin by Didier Nicolas Ain, made in Mirco around 1820. Needing a fair bit of work. Violin made in the Lebert Humbert workshop. '19th century German violin with the Thier label. Mirco violin from the beginning of the 20th century. Violin by JTL. '20th century Mirco violin. Missed the front there. Front picture doesn't seem to be appearing there. 20th century Mirco violin with a Steiner label. 19th century violin, amateur work. Interesting. Curious looking scroll. That's quite a high price for amateur work, €700. German violin from the end of the 19th century with a Galliano label. Rare half-size violin by Amédée Dudouin. '20th century Mirco violin, an Arthur Parasot label. 20th century violin. Violin by JTL. Just thinking about loading up the final picture. Violin by Louis Bazin. Violin by stick by Usha Pair. and a frog and button for the same period. Violin bow of the Kunyahuri workshop. A Harmond violin bow. Violin bow by Charles Nicholas Bazin. Violin bow from the workshop of Jean-Francois Darbe. Violin bow from the Cien Bazin workshop. Violin bow Jean-Francois Darbe. 20th century German violin bow. Violin bow from the Frechner workshop. Violin bow from the Picat School. Violin bow stick by Cien Bazin. Violin bow by El Morazon. Violin bow of the Picat School. Violin bow by Charles Nicholas Bazin. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Violin bow by Herman Tott. And a Lebert violin bow. And onwards. Another violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Violin bow stick from the workshop of Francois Picat. Just thinking about loading up. Let's see if we can see that one for now. Yep, back to it. Violin bow from the Picat workshop. Violin bow from the Picat Malines School. Violin bow by Francois Lot. Violin bow from the Bazin School. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lot. A violin by Michael Cotreau Miracle. 20th century Miracle violin. German violin, early 20th century. Violin made in the Schuster workshops, Mark Nukirkin. French violin made around 1760, replaced French head in the 19th century. Violin from the Lebert Humbert workshop. German violin from the end of the 19th century, with an Marti label. Violin made in the workshop of Lebert Humbert. A miracle violin, early 20th century. 18th century French violin. It's definitely need a bit of TLC. Late 19th century miracle violin, made as a Nicholas Ain model. '20th century miracle violin with the Violin label. Violin by Louis Motissier in Miracle. 20th century violin. Table partly stripped. Looks like all the varnish is a bit messed about on that one. JTL violin. '19th century miracle violin. The Strad label. '19th century miracle violin. German violin, second part of the 18th century. '20th century miracle violin. Violin by Nicholas Mateu. A pretty and rare half-size violin by Francois Lacavelle. Violin by JTL. Violin made in Le Bertumber workshops. 18th century French violin, original neck and pegs, damaged table. Interesting. It's a curious looking one, isn't it? €400. Interesting. Late 19th century miracle violin, Breton model. Violin bow from the German school, made around 1920, signed Arnold Voigt. Violin bow by F.R. Wunderlich. 3/4 violin bow in the style of Simon Frère. Violin bow stick by Cien Bazar. Frog by Morison. Violin bow by Roger Francois Lot, made around 1970. Violin bow by L. Morison Frère. Violin bow by Cien Bazar workshops. Violin bow from the Pajot school. Violin bow by Cugno Huri Usha. Violin by Eugene Cugno, around 1900. Internet is a bit funny today. Violin bow by Adolf Kurt Schuster. Violin bow by Louis Bazar. Violin bow by JTL. Bazar school violin bow. And a Bazar violin stick. And a German violin bow in a copy of a tort. It looks like it's got a kind of tortoiseshell or faux tortoiseshell frog there, although they don't mention that. It's interesting. Here we go. Violin bow by L. Morison. Violin bow from the workshop of Louis Bazar. Lebert violin bow. French violin bow made around 1890. Bow box from Chardon in Paris. Violin bow by L. Morison Frère. Cello bow by Eugene Cugno. Violin bow by L. Morison Frère. Violin bow stick by Joseph Forin. German violin, late 19th century. Violin made in the JTL workshops. Another JTL violin here. Violin of the Eastern countries. Got to love that terminology. Violin by JTL, 20th century miracle violin with the Quattro label. Violin by JTL. Late 19th century violin with a Louvet label. Violin in the JTL workshop. 20th century miracle violin. Violin by JTL. German violin from the beginning of the 20th century. Miracle violin made around 1890 from the Gustav Bazin workshop. German violin from the end of the 18th century with a Bergonzi label. Interesting. 20th century miracle violin. Violin made in the workshop of JTL. '20th century German violin. Miracle 19th century violin. Violin from the German school, early 20th century. 20th century French violin, Maggini model. '20th century miracle violin. Violin made in the workshop of Charles Jean-Baptiste Colomazin. Violin made in the workshop of Albert de Blaye. And a violin by Charles Clodeau, made around 1840. Violin made in the workshop of Otto Schuger, Frankfurt. And 20th century German violin bow. Violin bow from the Sienne-Bazin workshop. German violin bow. Frog and Button by Emile Francois Huchard. Violin bow by JTL. Violin bow by JTL. Violin bow by L. Morison Frère. Violin bow by Joseph Morison Père. Violin bow by Paul-Émile Miquel. Double bass bow by L. Morison Frère. Just thinking about it. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. And a beautiful cello bow stick from the Bazin school. A violin bow by Marcel Lapierre. Lebert violin bow. And violin bow by Joseph Alfred Lamy Père. We go onwards to the next lot of interesting things. And we have a violin bow by Charles Nicholas Bazin. Oh, something a bit different. We have a letter from Charles Dancier, student of Berlioz, addressed to Charles Gand around 1860. That's pretty cool. 150 to 200 euros there. Violin bow stick by Julius Heinrich Zimmermann. Violin bow stick by Charles Alfred Bazin. Frog and button of the same period. An invoice from H.C. Silvestre for a violin by Francesco Ruggier, signed and dated March the 5th, 1897. 400 to 500 euros I want for that, so quite a lot. Cello bow from the Pierre Guillaume workshop, made around 2000. An invoice from H. Silvestre for an Italian violin, signed and dated January 5th, 1886. 400 to 500 euros. Violin bow by JTL. Violin bow by El Morizon. Invoice of Conrad Glaser, made in Brussels on December 29th, 1908. And a violin bow by Eugene Cugnot. Violin of Mircourt. French violin from the end of the 19th century in a Maggini model style. Late 19th century Mircourt violin, Breton model. 20th century violin with a Sudersi label. Violin made in Mircourt around 1930. A viola from Mircourt, the 20th century. 399 back. A violin by Lebert Humbert, Mircourt. '19th century German violin. German violin from the beginning of the 20th century. 20th century Mircourt violin. Half-size Mircourt cello there. I was wondering where we're going to get into some other things. French violin, second part of the 18th century. Varnish is a bit funny on that one. Violin from the Cousineau workshop, Mircourt. 19th century violin with an Aldrich label. Mircourt violin, late 19th century. Violin of the Lebert Humbert workshop. Another 20th century Mircourt violin. Violin by JTL. 20th century Mircourt violin with a Martist label. Just thinking about it again. A violin by Lebert Humbert. Another Mircourt violin here. Slightly a bit more interesting. Another Mircourt violin around 1920 with a Viome label. Another Lebert Humbert violin, which seemed to be the most popular today. Another violin from Lebert Humbert. Mircourt violin from around 1940. Violin bow of the Bazin school, made around 1900. Violin bow by Charles Alfred Bazin. German violin bow made around 1950. Some more documents here. We've got a certificate of expertise from André Richomme for a violin bow by François Tourt in 1943. Violin bow by Louis Joseph Morizon Père, imitation tortoiseshell. It's a bit of an unfortunate damage to the head there. Invoice of Silvio Tua, made in Nice, January 30, 1938. And violin bow by Louis Bazin. Violin bow by François Lotte. And violin bow from the Simon School, made in the style of Joseph Vorin. Violin bow by Roger François Lotte. Etienne Vatelot, French bows, Paris 1976, 2 volumes. There you go, if you want to know about French bows a bit more. Violin bow by Charles Alfred Bazin. And onwards, violin bow by Roger François Lotte. When it loads in, loads of tools and equipment for luthiers in 2 boxes. Interesting enough. Bits and bobs. Violin bow by François Lotte. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Violin bow by L. Morizon Frère. Cello bow by Roderick Paysold. German violin bow, made circa 1920. Violin bow, stick and button by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Viola bow from the Simon School. Cello bow by Louis Joseph Morizon. A violin, late 18th century or early 19th century. Violin from the JTL workshop. German violin for the beginning of the 20th century. German violin made around 1800. Violin by Didelot, made in Miracle, 19th century. 20th century German violin. 20th century violin. Interesting, Antonio Guadagnini label. An interesting looking thing, that one. 20th century Miracle violin. And a violin from the Cousineau workshop in Miracle. Another Miracle violin. Violin made around 1900. '20th century Miracle violin. Another 20th century Miracle violin. Violin made in the workshop of Lebert Humbert. Violin from the German school, late 19th century, early 20th century. Violin, second part of the 18th century. '20th century Miracle violin. A cello, probably of Asian manufacture. '20th century miracle violin. And violin by Lebert Humbert. 7/8 violin made in miracle. It's the first 7/8 of this auction. Modern industrial cello, probably Asian. Early 20th century violin. Violin from the Lebert Humbert workshop. 3/4 miracle cello. Violin bow by Mark Lebert. Violin bow by L. Morizon. Violin bow stick and button by Charles Louis Bazin. Violin bow from the Maire Pajot School. Violin bow by Charles Nicolas Bazin. Violin bow stick by JTL. Mounted with bits from the same period. Violin bow stick by L. Morizon. Once again mounted with bits from the same period. Violin bow stick by Pierre Cugnot. Cello bow from the workshop of Vincent Tricot. Violin bow from the Bazin School. Violin bow by Charles Louis Bazin. Violin bow from the Bausch workshop. And violin bow from the Bazin School. And I think we're on to the final page now. Oh, not many on here. So we've got a violin bow by Cugnot-Houry. And a violin bow by Eugene Cugnot. And a violin bow by Cugnot-Houry. So there we go. So that is the first Vichy auction. The other ones will be up in the next few days. Actually a lot more interesting than I thought. There's some quite interesting violins. Some really good kind of 18th century French stuff and some other interesting 18th century German ones and some other decent ones. So yeah, not a bad auction actually. It was quite doable to go through that. So I'll put a link in the description. Check it out and see what you think. And the next few days we'll put up the other ones which I think progressively get of higher quality, I believe. So this would be the ones where it needs a lot of repair, restoration, and then middle one is probably stuff which is kind of okay, needs a bit of work, a bit better, and then I think the last one's going to be the kind of higher tier valuable stuff. So yeah, another interesting auction. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Ciao. Many thanks for tuning in to the Musical Instrument Investigator. I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please like, subscribe and turn on notifications, and watch out for the next video coming soon.